Hey everybody, in this iClone Basics tutorial we're going to run through the UI or the user interface of iClone 7. So we're going to just kind of skim through the basics. It doesn't go into too much detail. I'd recommend in combination with this tutorial, if you're a beginner, that you watch the tutorial on viewport navigation for how I navigate the scene, because we're not going to really be explaining that too much. Navigate my viewport here. Okay, but I'm just going to kind of show you what is what on your screen right now. So right now what we have is our standard view. Okay, and we're going to talk about our workspace views a little bit later on. But let's go through the basics first, starting from the top to the bottom here. Okay, so on the very top we have a file in the file menu here. Basically, you can get a new project, open your project, save projects. You can import a few things, export a few things, including cameras and FBX files, and find your recent projects here. Pretty straightforward. In the edit menu here, we have stuff like your basics, your very commonly used functions like scale, duplicate, align objects. You can link objects. A couple other things here as well. And here you'll find your project settings and your preference, which are two really good little items to know. Okay. You can also use the Control P and Control Shift P hotkeys for these two. Okay, and create is probably the most useful file menu item up here. Okay, so you can create primitive shapes. For example, if I go to create primitive shape, I can create a box in my scene. Boom, there it is. Okay, it just shows up in my scene, and I can press the W hotkey, and I can move it around using the gizmo. Okay, but I'm just going to go ahead and press delete and delete that box for now. You can also create other things like surfaces, sky, room, planes, particles. You can create a number of different trees and billboards and physics. It's often used for creating lights as well. There's different types of lights you can create on your scene, as well as cameras. So the create menu is very, very useful. And you can also access that by right-clicking and going create in your scene like this. For your stuff like lights and cameras, okay, so these are the main things that you normally use the create menu for. You can right-click in your scene and achieve the same thing. Okay, beside create, there's modify. Okay, we're not going to talk too much about this. This gets into modifying stuff, props and terrains and stuff like that. Animation is where all your animation stuff is, depending on what object you have selected. So if I select this item here in the middle of this sphere and I go to animation, you'll see we have a couple of items here like edit animation layer and prop puppet that'll be enabled, and we'll talk about that in other tutorials. Render is where you just kind of, once you're finished your project, you render everything out. View is your stuff like your camera navigation. Okay, and we talk about this in the viewport navigation tutorial, which I highly recommend if you're a beginner. Okay, you can use these items, or you can just use the hotkeys, which I highly recommend. Okay, but in Window, we're going to talk a little bit more about this because Window, the workspaces are pretty useful. Okay, so you can go to Workspace here. Currently, we're set at our standard workspace. Okay, so we have our Content Manager on the left, our Modify panel on the right. Okay, and tucked in behind our Content Manager here, we have the Scene Manager, which is all the items in our scene, and we can kind of move this over and see all the items in the scene, and the Visual section, which is your lighting, your shadows, your Toon Shader, and your effects, post effects, and global illumination. Okay, and we talk about that in other tutorials as well. These are the three main ones that you'll be working with, though. So if you have your standard workspace enabled, you'll have those. You can also go to your animation workspace. If you're focusing on animating something, it won't really have those because we're focusing on animation. We don't need to fool around with lighting or props or anything like that. Just the animation. So it opens up the timeline and the modify panel here on the right and your mini viewport, which is often useful for animating things from different angles. Okay, and there's also the workspace for visual effects. So this one, of course, will have your visual tab, which we showed earlier under the Content Manager. Okay, so the same stuff like ambient lighting. So when you're tweaking, when you've done all your animation and stuff, or maybe in the middle of it, you want to tweak your scene appearance, your lighting, or your shadows and stuff like that, this is the workspace that you'll normally want to use. Okay, and there's also a mini viewport there as well, and your Scene Manager. Okay, Window Workspace, and there's also the Final Render one. Okay, so this is when you want to have a nice view, big view of it. There's also all panels. So you'll notice now behind the Content Manager there's a lot more panels, including preferences and projects, and render and mini viewport are also over here. Okay, so this is kind of basically everything in your scene. And of course you can toggle between these using Control 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, and full screen is the final one here when you want to kind of see what everything looks like, the final version. Okay, and you can save your layout and you can reset it back to the standard as well. Okay, let's go back to the standard, which I normally use here, and go to Window and Toolbar. So there's a number of different toolbars here, which are right under the File menu. Okay, so right here, this is your new project, open, save, and this one here is Current Frame Preview. I often use this for getting a preview of your current scene. It just quickly exports an image of your current frame. Okay, here, and this one is also Render. Okay. And there's undo, your standard navigation stuff here, move, rotate, scale for your props, okay? So if you go to Window Toolbar, this is your project ones I went through, and the general ones are the next ones. And then there's camera. Okay, so beside the general ones here, there's the camera ones, which we talk about in more detail in the viewport and navigation tutorial. I highly recommend that one. Okay, these ones here are global illumination, and these ones here are for physics. Now you can click and drag any of these toolbars. If you click on the green kind of column there, you can move them down to another level here if you want, and you can set the camera stuff, for example, on its own level. You can move it back up by just clicking and dragging, kind of placing it where it was before, and you can kind of move these columns a little bit further in if you want. If you want more space for other columns, you can do so, and then there's those double arrows that appear, and you can kind of show it like that. Okay. And we'll just I like to kind of keep it like this, clean and organized, all right? We'll just keep it like that for now. And of course, if you have any plugins, your plugins will appear here. You can see I have a few in my iClone. And your help files, okay? So all the help stuff right here, you don't really need to listen to me blabber on. You can just go up here to the online manual and find out whatever you need, okay? But some of you, of course, prefer the videos. Okay, so besides that, a little bit further down, we have our content manager here, which is the main one you're going to, find all your content in. Here's your actors, and you have these tabs at the top. There's actor, animation. This is stage, which has stuff like cameras, atmospheres, and interesting stuff in there. And your props you'll all find in the set tab up here. Okay, and under media you'll find videos and materials and music. And up here is the package. So this is where you'll find all the packs that you've purchased kind of organized according to title here and stuff. Okay, so just alphabetically ordered according to the packs that you've purchased previously. All right, in addition to that, if you go into, say, for example, the set tab up here, and I go into props, and I go into 3D blocks, and go into ARC, you'll see these folder hierarchy will appear up here. If you want to go back in the hierarchy, you can just go to the 3D blocks like that, prop. You can also just go back here to back to previous folder, okay? But I like to kind of just click on these things and go back and forth like that way. So all your content is found in here. Pretty simple and straightforward. And behind that is your scene manager, okay? So here's all the stuff that's in your scene. You can see there's balls. You can select all these balls right here. And there'll be a yellow selection box around the ones that are selected, okay? And if you want to focus on those, we talk about how to do that in the viewport and navigation tutorial. And twirl up the props here. You can also twirl down the lights, so you can see there's a number of different lights in this scene here. And there's one single camera. You can select the camera just like that. Okay, you can also switch from your camera to your preview camera. All right, back and forth. That's covered in the viewport and navigation tutorial. And you can also search for stuff as well. So say, for example, I have, I want to search for background. For example, I can just go up here and type in background. Okay, back, and the background will show up on the prop. Okay, so the search field can be very useful if you know the name, but you can't find it. You have so much stuff in your hierarchy, it's hard to find. Okay, now beyond the scene manager, there is the visual tab here as well. Okay, so the visual is when you want to really enhance the visuals in your scene with stuff like ambient occlusion. Okay, well, there's fog, there's HDR effects, there is image-based lighting or IBL. Okay, all this stuff can be found in the visual tab. Anything that visually enhances your scene can basically be found here. There's also the shadow settings and Toon Shader, as well as the effects, your post effects you can add onto your scene, as well as global illumination. Very important to know. And we talk about that in much more advanced tutorials. Okay, so these are your standard tabs that you'll see here. In addition to that, anytime you select something in your scene, your modify panel on the right will change the parameters that it shows. I have this prop selected, which is just a regular sphere. So we have our attributes right here, this tab. And there's also the animation tab, which is all the tools you can use to animate that prop, as well as the materials on that prop, okay? Not too complicated. And the physics involved with that prop as well, which doesn't have active physics right now. But if you activate it, you can see a lot of stuff will appear. We talk about that in other tutorials as well. Okay, so pretty simple and straightforward. Now, if you have a camera selected, your attributes are going to be different. So for example, if I go to my scene manager and I select my camera, you can see that all the attributes here are going to be different. You can click and drag any of these panels just like this as well. I also wanted to mention you can, click and drag any panel around. If I wanted to, hide my modify panel behind my content manager, I can do that as well. I can click and drag it down here. Okay, so if you want to do that, have everything on one side, you can do that as well. So we can click and drag the modify panel. We just need to actually go to that top up here and click the modify panel and bring it over here to the left side. You'll see it'll highlight, or to the right side rather. You can just click and it'll pop right back over there. Okay, down on the toolbar here, we have the option to toggle between real time and by frame, which is useful for when you're dealing with physics. We're not going to cover that right now. And you have your standard play, stop, go back to the first frame right here, back to the starting frame. So if I click and drag in my timeline right here, I have no animation, of course, but if I just click on this button right here, it'll take me all the way back to frame 1. Okay, and this one here goes frame by frame. Okay, these two here go frame by frame. And this one here goes to the end of your project, end and beginning. Okay, and this one toggles loop. So if you want your animation, you want your entire project to loop, your playback to loop, you can toggle this on. This one here is for vocal volume, and this one here is for music volume. Okay, and over here we have the project settings and the show timeline. If we click on project settings, you can also press Control-Shift-P, like I mentioned earlier. It'll open up all your overall project settings. So these are your macro settings in your scene. Okay, and you can go through these like 2D background. We won't explain too much about these right now, but you can close that down. And of course, you can also find it by going to Edit and Project Settings, and your preferences can also be found there as well. So small things like how your camera moves and snap to model and stuff like that can be found in here, and your real-time render options, which are very important. Okay. So last but not least, let's take a quick look at our timeline. So the timeline can be found down here, but I recommend using the F3 hotkey because you're going to be opening the timeline over and over and over again. So I recommend, getting used to the F3 hotkey. So you can open the timeline just like that and click and drag the top to make it, larger like this, depending on what how many tracks you need to show on your timeline. Let's take a quick look at an animation. Okay, so I'm going to show you a basic animation really quickly. So I'm going to select this green box here in the middle. Now, there's a couple of hotkeys that are really useful here. This move hotkey, world move, rotate, and scale. You can also use the W, E, and R hotkeys. Okay, so W for movement, E for rotate, and R for scale. We talk about that in other tutorials more. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press the W hotkey, and we're going to go to a different frame. So we can actually click and drag in the timeline here, which is the same as clicking and dragging in our timeline up here, as you can see. Okay, so let's go to maybe frame 60, and I'm going to just move this over here. Okay, boom. And what happens is we can't really see the track right now because we need to go over here to our track listing and select the ball main. We already have it selected, so it should appear a little bit further down on our timeline. Let's close down the project track right now since we don't need that. And you can see ball main right here. I always recommend having this object-related track selected because whatever you select in your scene, it's going to switch to that item. Okay, you can see the ball name changes. Ball main right here, and we have this keyframe in the timeline. Okay, so that's your simple animation. You can click and drag in the timeline or a simple animation like that. But I don't want to get into too much detail in the timeline. I just really wanted to show you the basic UI, where you can find all the stuff in your iClone setup. Now, obviously, the more that you use iClone, the more you're going to get familiar with this. But again, I recommend checking out all of our other iClone Basics tutorials as complementary to this one, especially our viewport navigation, which will cover most of the basics you need on your iClone journey. All right, so thanks so much for watching, everyone. Hopefully you learned a lot. If you have any further questions, you can always check out our forums at forum.reallusion.com, and I hope to see you in the next video.